How's it going? Today I'm going to discuss a little bit about my process of composition. A few years ago I produced a video on how I approach film scoring, and it's kind of a different animal because the inspiration that drives that kind of music is completely dictated by what's happening on the screen, by the writers, the directors, the dialogue, the action, the emotions that are emoted on the screen. Those things are all the sources for the inspiration on the emotional content that you're trying to underpin. When it comes to actually just writing a piece of music as a composition, inspiration comes from different places, and the process is different. When I'm scoring for film, a lot of my process is based on improvisation, organized improvisation. I think things through a little bit before I do that, but it's still basically based on improvisation. When I'm getting ready to actually write a piece of music, the inspiration, or whatever happens to be the inspiration for it, comes, and I will spend some time doing some improvisation, get some basic ideas fleshed out, but then I go to work actually scoring it, and it's in two parts. I use notation software for the first aspect of it, where I actually compose the music. And then I take all that information and I import it into a digital audio workstation software such as Traction or Logic or whatever, and then I finesse a performance out of that so that it sounds realistic. I think I found the perfect piece of music to actually illustrate this with you. It's my Choral Fantasy in G minor. The inspiration for it came kind of from an interesting place, and I will discuss all that and the process and how I do it. Let me show you how. So how I approach composition is a lot the same as I do for film scoring. The only difference is the inspiration comes when you're doing a film score from what's on the screen. With regular composition, it can be, the inspiration can come from anywhere. Stories, other performances of other composers' music. I have kind of a little hobby where I collect musical instruments, and but I can't get a different one until I've either mastered or at least can passably play the old one. Sometimes that brings out ideas of stuff to write. So this piece of music that I'm going to be showing you today was inspired by none of those things. It happened to be inspired by a piece of software. It's a choral sample library called Voxos. It's a sample library that is very cool. It's got a phrase builder, and you have up to 12 phrases that you can do, and you basically create these words with these syllables, and these are all Latin-based ones. But the idea is that these are Latin-sounding things, but they're not necessarily real words. I mean, I think there's like a handful of actual Latin words you can actually put together, but they're still not going to be grammatically correct in a sentence structure. But that's not the point anyway. I'm not trying to have this be a vocal masterpiece of conveying some message. This is meant to be emotionally impactful. So anyway, so I saw some videos on it. I decided I was going to buy it as soon as the tax came around, and I thought, you know what? In preparation for this, I'm going to write myself a nice choral piece of music that I can use with Voxos when it comes. And that's kind of how that's what inspired this. I've used a lot of different notation software titles in the past. I've used Finale, I've used Notion, I've used Sibelius, I've used Overture, I've used a handful of other ones, and I always kept on coming back to Finale. And recently I really have gotten into Notion because I also have it on my iPad, and you can write out the notes with the stylus, and it transcribes it into notation like this. That's really cool. And then so I have the computer version of that as well. And it actually does a pretty good job. I dig both of them, but I really prefer working in Finale because that's what I'm the most adept in. So when I approached this piece of music, I didn't want the orchestra to accompany a choir. I wanted the choir to be another instrument in the orchestra. because the choir doesn't have any meaningful text. It's not conveying any kind of message. It's really basically a part of the soundscape. I'm still using text that sounds cool, but it's meaningless, really. But it conveys power. I think it does convey that. It conveys power. It conveys sorrowful, meaningful stuff. So I guess it does convey meaning, but it's not in the same sense. It doesn't textually do that. I organized this into 4 distinct sections. They're contrasting, so that's the reason why I named it a fantasy or fantasia, because you've got 4 contrasting sections that are dissimilar but yet cohesive. But it's not like a sonata form or a fugue or anything like that kind of, that kind of structure, but it's still organized a little bit. So I'm actually going to play this for you, and we'll listen to it together. I'm going to have the score follow along, and yeah, so let's do that. Okay. So I have this big ending. There's a beginning, but then everything's quiet. The strings are just doing these kind of swells with the tubular bells. And then I have English horn. Come up with this kind of nice melody with these accents with the percussion. And the violin answers that initial melody with its own. And then the choir comes in, almost chant-like. Just kind of an introduction. And then we have the strings. And we have the choir coming in. Oops. Yeah. Sorry. Notice this is a cappella with the exception of the harp. Now here we come with the strings coming in. And this is a little conversation here. Comes this part 2, this section 2. This is a repeating ostinato parts in the strings with flourishes in the harp, and then brass come in, and they come in later, the next few measures, with the percussion and the brass have these accents. And the chimes are doing these little runs. Do, do, do. And the choir comes in with their powerful They go the super quiet section here where everybody whispers. This separates. Now we're going into the third section, where the strings have another ostinato pattern, but it's a little different. It builds. Okay, so now the violas, and then the second violins. And the brass are playing these kind of fanfare kind of melodies. Building up to this section that's coming in now. So this is the same thing that was just sung, but a cappella. Now we're leading into the fourth section, which is, again, melodic, kind of sad, melancholic. Strings come in to help out with this. And basically the same thing that we did before, but a little more fleshed out with the strings. So we're bringing back everything to, here's the violins with their rising part they had in the beginning, answered by the French horn. And then ending in a nice E flat major for some of that resolution that I like to have. And that's that piece. So writing this took the better part of 3 weeks. I only could write it on my spare time, which is usually the last, like after my family went to bed for a couple hours a night. And some days I struggled with just a couple of measures, other days it just flew like crazy. But that's kind of how inspiration works. Some days you struggle to make that connection, and other times it just flows like water. So once I'm completely happy with how things are working, and by the way, it's never completely happy. Crawford Gates, who was an amazing composer who recently passed away, look him up. Really, he's an amazing composer. But he and I were friends, and he gave me some advice once and said, when you get finished with a piece of music, make sure that you could never change a note. And I'm thinking, there's no way. I can always tweak. I can always go back and mess with things and polish this up and enhance this or you know. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized that he wasn't saying make it perfect. He was saying be happy with your result. Be satisfied with it enough where you can move on. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to be happy with the results. And I've since learned the wisdom of that advice, because seriously, I could take every piece of music that I've ever written and try to improve on it, but if I do that, then I basically rob it of its initial essence of inspiration. Those initial flowing ideas get reworked through the lens of all those years of experience between then and then. I'm a different composer than I was 20 years ago. I would change things a lot, and I shouldn't. Some ideas are unfinished and they're worth trying to revive. But for pieces of music that I did completely write back 20 years ago, I shouldn't mess with them. I should leave them alone, because that was a snapshot of what I was like back then, and the ideas that I had and how I developed those ideas. So anyway, once I'm pleased with something, I like the way it looks, I like the way it sounds in my head, it's now time to take this information that's here and move it over to the digital audio workstation. And how we do that actually is you go to the file menu and click on export and then MIDI file. And then you tell where you're going to be saving it to, and I'm going to do it to my desktop. I already have one, so I'm going to replace it. I did this before. And so I always take format 1, which is all instruments saved in separate tracks. Kind of really crucial to have that, because you want to be able to nuance every single instrument. And so do that, and then you hit OK. And what it does is it takes all the information, all these markings, the tempo markings, the slurs, the staccatos, the dynamics, everything, and it assigns data to those notes in the form of what's called continuous controller data, or CC data. The reason why I like to have my monitors vertically situated is so that I can see all the instruments from top to bottom all at the same time without having to do any scrolling. And this is very advantageous as a composer, because then I can see everything that's happening in the orchestra. And so this is why this looks like this. It doesn't give me as much horizontal access, but that's the reason why I have it stretched over both monitors, which you can't see. But anyway, so I just wanted to show that to you before I got into the digital audio workstation part of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about digital audio workstations. When I first started getting into sample libraries, the very first one I started using was called Cubase SX, and it was rough. It was hard because it was very, very resource intensive, and I had limited hardware at the time, and it was difficult to have even 3 or 4 instruments playing at a time without it maxing out my RAM or whatever. It was powerful, and so. But about a year later, I discovered Traction, which at the time was version 1, and they were giving it away for free because they were anticipating getting ready for their second launch for version 2. And I fell in love with it because it's an all-in-one design. Everything is from the beginning to end, one page. And that made a lot more sense to me than the way Cubase had endless menu windows that came up. And But now it looks a little kind of weird like this because right now I've got it situated on the horizontal or the vertically aligned monitors, so I can see top to bottom a lot more, just like I like to see with the scores. But this time I usually stretch this across both monitors, but because this screen capture only captures one monitor at a time, I wanted you to be able to see the whole thing. It's an interesting thing. I've used Cubase, I've used Traction, I've used Digital Performer, I've used Logic, I've used Reaper, GarageBand, and I still continue to use Traction and Logic the most for varying reasons. I love both of those, and I could probably only deal with just one, but I wouldn't want to. So when I imported this into Traction, it looked like this. It had all the tracks, and it had all the instruments there, and it even has them named properly, but it doesn't have the tracks named, and there's no differentiation between the contrabassoon and the horns. And I wanted there to be organized the way I kind of like them on the score. We've got some space between each, and you also have to set these up where all of these play. As you see, there's nothing. This track contains MIDI generated clips, but there's no device for it to plug into. So that's why you have to do something like this, which is what I did here. I named the tracks. I put spaces in between the sections, and then I kind of went to town just editing all this information. I assigned all these to go through one player, which is this is Garriton Personal Orchestra. So I used, now these are empty right now, but when I did this before, these were all occupied by these instruments right here. And then I did the same thing for the brass and so forth. Each section had their own instrument tracks that they were routed to. It sounds a lot more complicated than it really is, and it literally probably took me about maybe 5 minutes to set up this document in this manner. Traction is really easy. That's the one thing I do love about it. I prefer editing MIDI in Logic, but I love doing audio in Traction. But in this particular case, I did both in the same document. So once I had all this organized the way I wanted to, I took it instrument by instrument, and I looked at the different information that was contained in each. All of the clips have notes, and they have a section under below here where you can see the data that is contained in there. The piccolo doesn't have any right now. I'm going to go to a different one. The English horn has this first little melody, and it has this curve that I drew into it using the pencil or using an actual mod wheel to make this sound like a real player was playing this. When you're playing with an instrument, it rarely just cuts off when you stop playing. You kind of have this little bit of a release of volume and pressure, and it makes it kind of die away a little bit. And that's what helps sell this as being a real English horn. When you listen to the recording, it sounds like a real player is playing that. If I just had it straight across volume-wise, it would still it would still have the right notes, and it would still sound kind of like an English horn, but it would sound very synthesized. This information right here makes it sound more human. Anyway, I isolated all of these instruments, and I did this with every single one of them. I made sure that the performances that each instrument was playing sounded realistic to me. And then I would highlight all of that section just to hear how they sounded all together. And if there were some times where the pans or the volumes needed to be adjusted in order so there wasn't anything stepping on each other's toes, I did that there. I didn't do a lot of volume controls yet on this section of it. I just wanted to make sure the performances were okay. Once I was happy with these tracks, I would select a track, and then I would create an audio version of that same track, and then I put those down here into this. Now all of the woodwinds together, I was really happy with the way the audio mix was at, so I just had them all be the same thing. And if you want to hear what that sounds like just by themselves. So. So that right there, now you don't hear any. There's no ambiance or reverb right now, and that's the way I kind of like to do it at first, because you want to be able to hear the instruments the way that they are, and not necessarily in any kind of acoustic space. But so, and then you do the same thing with. I did the same thing with the brass. I did the same thing with the percussion. I did the same thing with the harp. The choir, I did, made sure all those things were good, and then what I'm left with was a bunch of audio tracks. Here's my strings, here's my choir. Now this is where the actual mixing portion of this happens. I'm happy with the performances, but now I need to make sure that all the performances can be heard in light of the rest of the orchestra playing at the same time. This is where volume controls are drawn in a lot, so that I do a lot of fader automation right here. And I also do lots of EQing, because you don't want there to be a muddled mess where you have instruments vying for each other on their EQ frequencies. And so you can adjust that so that they have their sweet spot. So you can hear all the instruments playing at a time and not them stepping on each other's toes. So once I was happy with this mix, then I exported the whole thing into a single audio file. And this is where I would use a reverb. Now, actually, I lied, because in this one I do have a reverb that I use for references, and that is this really cheap one that came with Traction, and it's just a really generic basic thing. It still works and it sounds decent enough to do some basic editing to kind of hear kind of an idea of what it's going to sound like, but it's not perfect. So I don't use that for my final project or the final product. So once I've exported that audio file, which is really easy to do, you just go to Export, Render to a File, and then it comes up with this dialog box. You select what kind of file you want, whether it's WAV, AIFF, FLAC, MP3, OGG Vorbis, and then you render it, and then it saves it to where you want it to. Then what I do is then I import that into Logic, or I import that into Traction again, and this is where I deal with the reverb. And so that's how I do it. That's basically when I'm happy with the reverb settings and the EQ that I add on to this, then I export it as a finished file, and then I usually do it as both WAV and MP3 so I can share, and that's what people hear. So that's my process. That's part A, part B. And I think that I put a lot of emphasis on part B, mostly because that's the way I can share it with everybody. You don't have to be a musician or a composer or someone who can read orchestral scores to be able to understand and enjoy my music. You can listen to it right away. And it's a great time to be alive as a composer because I have these tools at my disposal, and it's relatively inexpensive compared to renting an orchestra and hiring out orchestrators and people to do all this stuff. Unless you were a court composer or a church composer back in the day, you didn't have access to this type of immediate feedback of your music. It was all in your head. It was all on the score, and that's what you had. And you hoped it would get published or performed someday. Now I can create my own performances. I don't have to wait to be published. I can publish this on my own. I'm not suggesting that my music is any better than anybody else's. It's not. It really is not. But I'm still proud of it, and I still think that I have a voice to share to you all. Let me know what you think of this. Let me know what you think of the song. Let me know what you think of my process. Maybe this has inspired you in your own music. Let me know. I'd love to hear any and all feedback. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.